everyone. Welcome to episode 213 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris. And we're recording from two different states today. I'm in Book Cougars headquarters here in Connecticut, and Emily is up in Michigan. Emily, would you like to explain the circumstances?
Sure. On episode 212, we gave you a very quick recap of what happened in my life recently, but I think I was so sleep deprived, it's worth revisiting. Unexpectedly, my daughter went into labor 3 weeks early. So I hopped on an airplane from Connecticut to Michigan so that I could be here for the birth of my first grandchild, Nina.
Wonderful.
It's been quite a whirlwind, and I'm still slightly sleep deprived, but not as bad as I was on the last episode. And I'll be here for a few more weeks. And it's been lovely to spend time with my daughter, Rachel, and get to know Nina, who, of course, is the perfect, most beautiful angel baby ever there was.
Absolutely.
Because I'm her grandma.
Yes, she is adorable. I'm so glad you could be there for both of them.
Me too. And I'm glad that through the power of technology, we can still do our wonderful Book Cougars things that I love to do so much. So thank you, Chris, for holding down the fort of Book Cougars headquarters. I don't know.
My pleasure. So in announcements and updates, we have a new patron to thank whose name is, ironically, Nina.
Yeah. How funny is that?
That is amazing.
Yeah.
So Nina,
thank you, Nina.
We appreciate your support so much.
We do.
So now on to our regular segments. Emily, what are you currently reading?
Well, this might shock everyone, but in my flurry to pack my suitcase in about 15 minutes flat, I did not grab any books, which is unusual for me for packing. I did grab my Kindle, which has, of course, 300 books on it or something, but I didn't grab any hardcover or paperbacks or anything like that. So I decided to go to my daughter's bookshelf because I love to read on my Kindle, but there are times too when I just want a book in my hand. And I came across The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivey, which was one of her favorite books of all time. And I've always wanted to read it. I mentioned that recently, maybe in one of our reading salons, I can't remember. And there was so much positive feedback about the novel that it made it go even higher on my TBR. So when I saw it on Rachel's shelf, I grabbed it, and I'm about halfway through and really enjoying it. It's about Jack and Mabel, who are in Alaska. It's 1920. They went off to make their own way. She comes from a wealthy family. He's a homesteader of sorts, and they're middle-aged, and they lost a child. And out in the snow appears a child that you can't tell if she's real or if she's a fantasy of their imagination, because as you might imagine, when you're in Alaska in the dead of winter, you might get lonely and start to imagine things. So I don't want to do any spoilers, but I just will say that the writing is lovely. I got lost and swept up in the story right away. And I'm also listening to the audiobook as I take my daughter's dogs for walks. And it's narrated by Therese Plummer, who's doing a fantastic job.
Oh, very cool. That one has been on my radar too. And I've only heard people highly praising it. A nice one to read in summer, right? When it's all hot and you're all sweaty.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that last night. I was like fanning myself with the book and thinking like, oh, it's so nice to be remembering winter right now, which they are very much fully engrossed in this novel.
Nice. Well, I started another one for Sue Jackson's Big Book Summer Reading Challenge. This book is, let's see, with the index and everything, 758 pages. It's Mary, Queen of Scots by Antonia Fraser. This was an international bestseller when it came out, and it was published in 1969. It is so fantastic. So it's a big book, obviously, but the chapters are pretty short. They might just be 20 pages or so. So it's my morning book. When I wake up in the morning, I usually have time to read before I have to jump into other things. So I've been reading a chapter each morning and really enjoying it. There have been other biographies of Mary, Queen of Scots, but what Fraser is doing, as she says here in her author's note at the very beginning, was that what she ended up doing is trying to shed light using the modern research that had been done and new things discovered back then, is to really try and figure out what Mary, Queen of Scots, must have been like as a person. So I'm just on page 138 as of this morning. I'm through chapter 6. And Mary, Queen of Scots, actually was primarily raised in France. She was a child, I think she was 5 or 6 when she went from Scotland to France, where she was pretty much betrothed to marry the future king of France. And he becomes king of France when he's 17 and she's 18. And he doesn't live very long. I don't even think he's king for a year before he passes away. And so there Mary is at 19 in France with, a lot of dicey things coming in her future.
A big crown.
A big crown. Oh my gosh. I don't know that much about French or Scottish history. I mean, I have to say, like, what I knew before starting to read this book of Scottish history was basically from the Outlander series, right? And even then I was surprised about the French connection. I had no idea, at least at the point where I'm reading, the Reformation has happened. So there's the Catholic Protestant split, and the English crown has gone Protestant, whereas the Scottish, their clans at this point are trying to be Catholic, but there's a Protestant contingent. And the French monarchy is still Catholic. So Scotland's getting support from France. And then there's rebels and infighting from England. Fascinating.
A lot to manage.
A lot to manage. So I'm really excited to be digging into this one. Mary, Queen of Scots, as I said in a prior episode, as a kid, I saw a movie starring Vanessa Redgrave that really captured my imagination about Mary, Queen of Scots. And I also fell in love with Vanessa Redgrave, who also played Guinevere in the movie version of Camelot. So a lot of warm, fuzzy feelings.
I have a big book summer question for you, because The Snow Child is 389 pages, but then there's like 20 pages of reading guide and all this kind of stuff after. And I was like, can I count that as a big book read? It doesn't have page numbers, though.
Yeah. So what does Goodreads say it is?
Oh, that's a good question. Hold, please.
Hold, please. That is an important bit of factual information to find out.
And I also do love, I think it's so interesting what you're saying about even a big book being split up into like little digestible chunks. Mm-hmm. The Snow Child is like that. Like there's a couple paragraphs, and then there'll be like a little asterisk and a break within the chapter. And there's something about that just makes it go down more quickly,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because when you look ahead and you think like, oh, I just have 5 more pages, it doesn't seem like that big. And you're like, okay, That's great. And now I'm going to move along to what other book I'm reading or going to work or what have you.
Right. So it says the Kindle version. Oh, it says it's 416 pages for the regular version.
All right.
Go, Emily. Go, Emily. Okay. I've got another big book in my belt.
Woohoo!
Under my belt. In my belt. Under my belt.
It's a pretty thick belt, I guess, if it's in your belt. But you never know.
Definitely.
It could be like a fanny pack holder for your book.
So, Chris, what did you just read?
Well, like you, I finished Fellowship Point by Alice Elliot Dark. You want to jump into talking about this one?
Yes, I did a tri-hybrid read. I read it on my Kindle. I read the big honkin' hardcover, and then I had the audio, which was narrated by Cassandra Campbell. And this is the one I was reading when I got called away. So the hardcover did not come with me. And I ended up, doing the Kindle audio read. What about you?
Well, I had the paperback that I picked up as soon as you and Kate and I decided we were going to do this as a buddy read. And I know some listeners have joined us in reading this as a buddy read too. Thanks to everyone who's participating in that. But then I decided to get it on my Kindle because I wanted to read it at night and anytime I had some minutes here and there. So that's how I consumed it mostly. Although I did consult the map that is in the paper version. Which
yes.
I'm holding up to Emily right here, which is nice. I mean, you don't really need the map necessarily to understand anything that's going on in the story. It's just kind of nice to see the layout of the area. Would you agree?
It's kind of one of those classic bays that can be found off the coast of Maine, which is where the novel takes place.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the story a lot. I love the characters. I do have to say that, and I know we're going to try and keep this spoiler free because it's not a read along book. I think when we do read alongs, we'll sometimes have spoilers, but as a buddy read here on the podcast, we're going to keep it spoiler free. But there is a section in the middle where you kind of go back in time with one of the character stories. And I have to say, I didn't really always enjoy that. I felt like it kind of slowed the story down for me. So that first half of the book, I just sped through it. It's focused on the two women characters. I really love both of them. They're so different. One is married with children. She has 3 sons, and her husband is an academic. They're in their 80s. And then the other, who is her lifelong friend, these two women are lifelong friends, is single, child-free, and is a famous author.
Right.
Yeah.
Should we not spoil anything there? Okay, we won't spoil anything.
Yeah.
She's an author of books that some people realize she's an author for, and another series of books that they don't know that she's an author for. And I don't think that's a spoiler. That comes out very early in the novel.
Yeah. And so these women are in their 80s, and they're just so feisty and friendly. Like, you want to be their friend. One of them is a little bit more soft and compassionate and understanding, and the other one's a little bit more prickly and knows it to the point where she's talking, she's looking at some ducks or geese, I don't remember now, concerned about them drowning or something. And she's like, oh morons. And just that, she cares so much about them, but then she's like, morons. It just made me laugh out loud a couple times. And then I have to say, it made me burst into tears at one point. So, yeah. What about you?
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way as you do. So the beginning, I really thought I knew the direction that the book was going. I mean, I thought it was this kind of a character study on these two women who were older now, but looking back and forth into their life, where they currently were and how their friendships started when they were young and how their families came to be residing in these, houses near each other in Maine, which I loved that aspect of it. Geographically, I loved it. They also spend time in Philadelphia. And so they spend time in Philadelphia and then they summer in Maine. And eventually they do start spending more time in some winter time in Maine. But then this other character is introduced, Maud, who is in the publishing industry and starts to work with the author. And I thought that was a really interesting addition to the book, and it really surprised me. I agree with you that the points where there was some epistolary parts of the novel, which I tend to really like letters and novels, I got a little bogged down in them. And I thought, just tell me the story directly. I don't really need it to be through letters.
Yeah, I felt that same way too. I felt like it was too obvious of a device. But then something happens and I'm like, click right back into it. The last quarter, maybe. Mm-hmm. I didn't exactly, keep tabs of the pages or chapters or anything, but then it really picked up again. And I thought that I knew what was going to happen, and it didn't turn out that way. So that was part of the fantastic last part of the reading experience for me. And these are wealthy people for the most part. They come from wealthy families, and you get the whole background to how they came to own this land, that their great-grandfather, one of their great-grandfathers had first built a home there.
Right. Yeah, one of the things I wrote down in my book journal was interesting structure. Like, the book surprised me over and over again in the structure of it and how she would insert a chapter to move the story along that I wasn't expecting, or a character that I wasn't expecting. And that part I really enjoyed.
Yes, I did too. And you worried about these characters and you celebrated with them. And in addition to that young editor that Emily mentioned, there's also a male character who is the gardener for a lot of the people on the point. And his story was really fascinating and surprising in terms of who he connects with while he's in a situation that he's in, and how relationships then develop and change. And I guess what I really appreciated is, somebody who's pushing 60, reading about older women has always helped me throughout my life, older girls, older women. So it's heartwarming to me and hopeful to read about women who are doing things and passionate about their life in their 80s.
I agree.
Yeah.
And still interested in their career or, like you're saying, passions that they have, but also the study of their friendship and how when you have a friend that spans such a long portion of your life that you can kind of understand them and be soft around that, but also take them to task if need be about how they're behaving or, needing them to move on in their life. Maybe that happened with one of the characters. I really enjoyed that study of a friendship that you don't often see with older women.
Right.
At least I don't in my reading. I'm thrilled that other people are reading along and are piping in over on Goodreads. So please do that. We would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah. And another shout out to Karen Barker for Books for giving this such a positive review and reminding us both, because it was on our TBRs at one point. We just never got to it. So Karen's plug was what pushed us over to get on it now.
Yeah, it was one of my hopefuls last year for a big book summer. I got it out of the library and everything. And several people on Goodreads said, because remember I did that stack of big novels and, said, these are my hopefuls for novels. And which do you think I should read? And many people said Fellowship Point, and then I just didn't get to it. So thrilled to do it with the help of holding hands with you and Kate.
Yeah,
is really nice.
Right back at you. And I think I had read some people saying it wasn't what they thought it would be. And it has gone both ways with people saying, I loved it, and other people saying it wasn't what I thought it would be. I didn't really care for it.
Yeah.
I really liked it. And I could easily see this being made into a movie.
Oh, yes.
And it's one of those things too, like you want more of the characters. So it's almost like, hey, do a series, even going back in time with their lives or something. But I don't know if the author has any plans for that at all.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, there's so much serialization of novels now, so it'd be cool if they did.
Yeah.
Well, if anyone knows, let us know.
Well, Emily, what else have you read?
The only other thing I read was short stories for my continued short story project for this year. I did have a hiccup the week the baby was born. I did not read a short story. But before I left, I had been reading about Alice Elliot Dark, who is the author of Fellowship Point, the novel we were just talking about. And she has a very famous short story called In the Gloaming, which was originally published in the New Yorker in 1993. And I was desperate to get my hands on it for the week of my short story project when I was reading Fellowship Point, and I couldn't get access to it online. And I went to the Guilford Public Library, and the head librarian, the executive director, happened to be behind the desk. And he found that there was a big anthology on the shelves called The Best American Short Stories of the Century. Ooh. This thing is like 1,000 pages. I had to leave it at home. As you can imagine, it didn't make my suitcase. But it was edited by John Updike and Katrina Kenison, and it was published in April of 2000. And there's In the Gloaming by Alice Elliot Dark. And oh my gosh, Chris, this short story, it is about a mother whose son, Laird, is dying of AIDS. And he's confined to a wheelchair and he moves home. And it's really about the end of his life and his being angry. At first in the story, he's quite angry about being confined to a wheelchair and his life coming to an end. And then the story kind of takes a turn and he and his mother start to reminisce. The writing is so beautiful. It was so sad to me. I mean, Laird is 30 years old. My son Jacob is 30. It was very, very touching about a mother's love for her son, and also how the father, he just couldn't face his son during the time of his death. And the story takes a turn at the very end that I will not spoil. But it was also made into a movie, this short story, directed by Christopher Reeve during the time when he was confined to a wheelchair himself. And it starred Glenn Close. I think that came out in 1997. At some point, I'd like to watch that. It was in my plans. But I have to say, until I read reviews of the short story, I don't think I realized that he was dying of AIDS. It never was very clear, but I think it's one of those cases that had you read it, in the New Yorker in 1993, when it came out, when you were at that point in history, it would probably have been obvious to you,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Something interesting about reading things 20 years later, 30 years later.
Right. Well, yeah, in the time that you're living, right? When it comes out.
Right.
Yeah.
So I decided, since this collection was so huge and vast, the next week I read a story called Janus by Ann Beattie. It was originally published in the New Yorker in 1985. And it's very short. And it's about a real estate agent that takes this shiny pottery bowl to her open houses, when she's showing the houses. And she'll sometimes even put other things away off the counter, and she'll put this bowl out. And she's convinced that it's the secret to her selling homes. It was a very odd story in a certain way. It never is mentioned, like this word Janus is never mentioned in the story. So I looked up the title, and Janus is the god of beginnings, gates, transitions, time, duality, doorways, passages, frames, and endings.
Wow.
I know. And I was like, whoa, that totally makes me rethink the whole story. Our buddy, the author Shirley Kaywood, has a workshop where she talks about how to title your poems and your writing. And I thought, wow, this is a perfect example of that. Like I said, it made me want to read the story all over again and say, oh, okay, I get what she's trying to do with this bowl and what it represents.
Very cool. Yeah, that sounds awesome. I love that, learning about that. Because, if you're not steeped in the classics in that way, the ancient classics, you just don't get it. And it's okay. The story still works, right? But then once you do understand those things, it's like, oh.
Yeah, it added a whole layer.
Yeah.
Very smart writer. And I'd never read Ann Beattie, and that's part of why I chose that story out of the collection. And then, of course, I had to look and see if Willa Cather was represented in this collection. And she is. And this is going to shock you. It shocked me. But the story that's in there happens to be the short story that is the final short story for your Willa Cather reading project.
Double birthday?
Yes.
Get out. Wow.
Yeah.
That's so
Isn't
surprising.
That
is. That is a bizarre.
So I was like, my plan was to read it. Now it's, like back in Connecticut. So I'll see if I can find it. Maybe you have it posted.
Yeah. You can read it on, you know what? That one you can't read on the Willa Cather archive because I think it's still on copyright. Is what that is. Okay. But I will get you a copy.
That'd be great. Yeah. I thought we could read the final short story in your project together.
How fun.
And then the other one I read this week, because you know how that big thing's been going around about the New York Times 100 best books. Everyone's posting the books they've read from the 100 best books. But then they also asked authors to choose their, I think, 10 favorite books they've read over the last 20 years or something.
Yeah, I think that's how the list was formed. The list is from those authors. Okay. Like they compilated all the authors' submissions. And that's why I think some people are up in arms because they're like, there's no Murakami on it or whatever. Well, it's not a qualitative assessment. It's these hundreds of authors who contributed. And, authors, sometimes you hear that like, oh, that person is a writer's writer, right? Like writers tend to read writers for different reasons.
Yes.
Like Alice Munro, right? Who we'll be talking about her later on in this episode. Writers will read her to study the craft.
Right. So one of the books mentioned by Jennifer Weiner was Amy Bloom's A Blind Man Can See How Much I Love You, which is a set of short stories that I've never read. So I read the title story, which was the first story in the collection. And it's about a single mother, Jane, and she has a daughter who's very tomboyish and is really meant to be a boy. And the story takes them through her, I think the daughter's name is Jess, her desire to have gender surgery. And Jane goes to like a support group over by the hospital where they're having the surgery. And it just walks you through that experience. And I thought, talking about what I said about the Alice Elliot Dark story, timing wise, I mean, this story by Amy Bloom came out in 2001. So it was a long time before people were talking so openly, I think, about gender reassignment surgeries. And so I found this story just fascinating to read.
Oh, yeah, it sounds like it. And Amy Bloom, didn't you say one time that she's a writer's writer? That like a lot of writers read her kind of religiously. And I think in more recent years that she's really maybe become a more popular writer.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, reviews of this story collection are mixed because she also doesn't shy away from tackling difficult subjects. And her sentences are just very rich. You have to really read between the lines with her writing. And she has very interesting characters. So I will continue with that collection. I was lucky enough to be able to get it on my Kindle via Hoopla.
Nice. That's great.
Yeah. So what about you? Did you read a short story?
You know what? I did. I actually read two short stories. So the first is the Willa Cather story for July, which is Uncle Valentine. That was published in 1925. And it's not one I'd read before. And so speaking of a name association, you know, Valentine, Saint Valentine, it dawned on me after I'd finished it, like, oh, Valentine. So I read a little bit about Saint Valentine. So this is a story set in Pittsburgh where Cather had lived for 10 years and then also returned there for another 10 years. She's much more apart and familiar with Pittsburgh than I had initially thought when I first started reading her and learning about her. And so this story, it kind of has a framework of her novel, My Antonia, where there's two people talking and then a third person comes up from the past. And then the story goes into the story of that person. And like, so for My Antonia, it's a man who relates the story of My Antonia. And in this story, Uncle Valentine, it's a woman who's remembering this man who was a composer. And it's kind of loosely based on a friend of Cather's who was a composer from Pittsburgh who passed away early. It's his story of kind of a bad marriage, which is a theme in Cather's writing. You know, marriages of incompatible people. Then there's another sub-theme of what that does to creative artistic types. So I really enjoyed the story, and it has a really great ending that I didn't anticipate at all. Another Willa Cather thing. The other day, it was apparently like National Hot Dog Day. And I happened, I happened to see that. The New York Public Library posted a bunch of historic photos of hot dog vendors. One of them just struck me as something that I could see Cather walking up to in 1910 or something. And then I thought, I wonder if Cather ever ate a street hot dog. So being on social media and access to polls, I asked a poll on Instagram. I shared that and I said, you know, I wonder if Willa Cather ever ate a street hot dog. The two options were yes, at least once, and no way was the other option. So 77% of people responded saying yes, at least once. And then 23% said no way. Willa Cather never ate a street hot dog.
It was below her.
Yeah, or just too aware of germs. Who knows? But now I'm going to have to reach out to some Cather scholars and ask them, did Cather ever eat a street hot dog?
Is there any archival footage of Cather eating a hot dog? And then here's the big question. Did you have to go get yourself a hot dog that day?
No, I didn't. I didn't that day. But usually Laura and I eat hot dogs for the 4th of July. That's part of our tradition. So we had turkey hot dogs on the 4th of July on our grill.
Right on.
Yeah.
Okay.
The last street hot dog I got was actually outside of the New York Public Library. It was not a good one that day, unfortunately. Yeah.
That can kind of ruin it for you.
Little hot dog had been going round and around too long.
I know there are a couple hot dog trucks now in Connecticut, so we'll have to find them and add it to a Biblio adventure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, hot dogs are such great, convenient food. Mm-hmm. I mean, they can be messy as hell, too, depending what you put on them. All right, so the other story, talk about messy, that I read was The Birds by Daphne du Maurier. This is a story I have wanted to read for a long time. When I was a kid, I watched the movie The Birds, the Alfred Hitchcock movie, but it wasn't until in more recent years that I learned it was based on a short story by her. Laura and I had been driving the California coast, which we love to do, and we stopped at Bodega Bay, which is where Hitchcock filmed his movie. So there's a lot of images and eat here with birds. I was like, oh my gosh, so now I have to read the short story. So it came to me the other day that I needed to read it, and I did find a digital collection of her stories. It's The Birds and Other Stories. So I downloaded that. It's from Little Brown and Company, 2004. And that movie came out in 1963. The story itself, though, is not set in California. It's set on the coast of England, where many of her stories are set. Have you seen the movie The Birds?
It's one of those movies I'm not sure if I've just seen like the classic scene of them being chased by birds or if I've actually seen it. When I was in undergrad, I took a humanities class where we watched classic movies. So it very well could be that I saw it then, like we watched things like The Maltese Falcon. So I think I may have seen it then.
Okay. It's a good movie. Like I want to watch it again now, even though it's very different from the short story itself. I can still remember certain scenes that I think I felt when I was reading the short story. And it's about a man who's a homesteader on the coast of England there. He has a wife and 2 children. And one night he's in bed sleeping and he hears poking at his window, tapping at his window. And he goes and he looks and it's a bird. And then he shoos the bird away and then it comes back again and he opens the window and the bird goes for his eyes and he shuts the window and his wife's like, what's going on? Like, what is that racket or whatever? Everything escalates. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but it made me think of another short story I read called I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. And that is a vampire story that's more like vampire zombie type things about like this man who's the last surviving person, as far as he knows, to survive this horrific plague of vampires, right? For lack of a better word. And then, that just got me. Both of the stories, they're really challenging to read because if you put yourself in these people's position, what that must have been like. So The Birds, the short story, is about this man's efforts to protect his family from these huge amounts of birds that are just starting to attack humans. And they live on the coast, right? And so at first there are all these different types of birds, like birds that usually don't hang out together. Birds of a feather, right? I guess. These are different feathers that are flocking together. And then they all pass, but then he notices this endless white thing on the horizon, on the sea, on the ocean, and he realizes it's all seagulls. And they're just all sitting there waiting. Anyway, it's a really good, creepy short story. I really enjoyed it. So that kind of sent me down a little bit of a rabbit hole. So after I Am Legend, and that was made into a movie 3 times, that short story. The Last Man on Earth, 1964, starring Vincent Price, who I loved. He was like the star of my childhood, Saturday afternoons watching TV. And then there's The Omega Man, 1971, starring Charlton Heston. And then Will Smith's 2007, I Am Legend, was also based on that story. I don't think I watched any of those movies. But then I happened to have lunch on Friday with a friend who we always end up talking about books. And she brought up Mary Shelley's The Last Man, which they're now saying should be getting a lot more attention because it's the first kind of disaster story. It was written in 1826. I should say it was published. It's considered the first sci-fi novel. And it is about the last man, like who survives this apocalyptic, it's like post-apocalyptic fiction and that first story. So I thought, this is such one of those, again, another reading synchronicity, right? Where I had that conversation about The Last Man, and then I'm planning on reading The Birds. And it's just like, oh my God, this is right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had no idea The Birds would take me down this kind of rabbit hole, but I enjoyed the story very much. And I'm planning on reading on in that short story collection.
Very cool.
Yeah, so.
Have you read Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier?
Yes.
That's been on my list. I've never read that.
It is really good. She's known for writing creepy stories that are dark and psychological. Yeah, I want to read that. Well, not that. I'm sorry. I want to read more novels by her because Simon
Savage.
Yeah, Simon Savage, he had said once upon a time, I remember him saying that he really liked My Cousin Rachel even more than Rebecca. I'm pretty sure it was he who said that.
I've never read anything by her.
This episode is sponsored by
I Left My Hormones in Another World by Angela Wick. I Left My Hormones in Another World follows Jen Joyce, a trans woman with no love for fantasy, as she's transported to a magical other world for a classic sword and sorcery adventure. Author Angela Wick will be promoting the book at Bank Square Books in Mystic, Connecticut, August 4th from 1 to 3 p.m., and in the New London Public Library Community Room, August 7th from 5 to 6 p.m. Check out angelawick.com for more info and a preview of the first chapter. We'll put a link in the show notes to Angela's website, and it's really cool, I think, that she's got that first chapter available for people to read. So speaking of what's not dark and creepy and sad, we had an amazing Biblio adventure that was very bright and exciting.
It was very bright and involved water and pretty birds who didn't attack us.
Exactly.
Yeah, we went to Long Island and we put pictures on social media already. So I think we did a lot of stories that day. We probably actually need to do some posts with some of these photos that we took because it was a gorgeous day. We took the ferry from New London, Connecticut to Orient Point, Long Island, which is the North Fork of the east part of the island.
And then we hopped in the car right away. And we should back up and say we did do a vlog of the day on BookTube.
Yes.
So we will put a link to that in the show notes. So if you're not on social media, you can look at the video that we posted about our day, which shows snippets from our ferry ride amongst these other things that we're going to tell you about. So we got on the ferry, which, I mean, I could just ride a ferry all day. So
I know.
That was, I could have done that and gone back and forth and back and forth. But we did do some other very fun things. We landed at Orient Point, hopped back in the car, and drove. It took, I want to say, like just over an hour, right? To get all the way around to the other. It's like the other east-south fork?
Yeah, the South Fork. So like there's a big bay. There's a bay and bodies of water. So you kind of drive west around down to the south part. And we landed in Bridgehampton, where we had lunch at Armin and Judy's place, I Baguette You.
Delicious, French themed, so delicious food. And we were very hungry by the time we got there. So we were happy to do that. And it was walking distance to one of our main stops, which was the Barnes & Noble in Bridgehampton.
Yeah, this was one of their new layouts. They have a new style of store. And so we were excited to check that out. And it was a lot of fun to explore. It was very well lit. I know that was one of the things you really appreciated, Emily, that like the entire store was well lit, but kind of like within each section. So you didn't feel like you were blinded looking across the store or that things were sterile. They were very warm and well lit, like within each section, though.
Sometimes the lighting in those big bookstores makes me tired. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because it's like fluorescent lighting or something like that. And this just did not feel that way at all. It almost felt like it was lit by the sun. I didn't bother to investigate whether they were LED lights or just the way they were positioned, but it was really lovely. And the sections, the way they split the sections up, I mean, I think what's happened, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, is that Barnes & Noble has a new CEO. And he was the CEO of a British bookstore, right?
Yeah, Waterstones, yeah.
Waterstones. And so he's brought like a different ethos to the Barnes & Nobles and trying to make them feel more like indie bookstores.
Well, trying to make them a little bit cozier so that you feel like you're in a nook almost, as opposed to a library, which is like stacks of books. Right. So there's just no through sight line, which is nice and cozy. Really nicely done. In the wood, Barnes & Noble traditionally had dark wood shelving. This is lighter wood shelving. So everything feels much more airy. Yeah. And there was a woman there who had a double library cart of books. she was just loading that thing up. I was like, wow. I was like, you're really shopping for the group or something. Or I don't know what I said to her, you know. She's like, oh, I'm an interior decorator and I'm shopping for a client.
Yeah, so her job, everyone, is literally to go to Barnes & Noble and spend hundreds of dollars to fill the bookshelves of this home with books. And I, of course, had to ask her, like, is anyone going to read them? And she turned to me like I was a little bit, oh, lady. But she said, well, that's the hope.
Yeah. Yeah. She said, you know, that's the hope. And so she wasn't buying them for color coordination. She was buying new hardcovers that looked really good. So we actually hand sold a couple to her.
Yes. I got to watch Chris completely morph into her bookseller self. She was walking around that store handing her books left and right.
Oh,
it was very
fun.
cool.
Yeah, a lot of fun. And I'm glad that she was willing to chat with us about that, because what a cool job. Yeah.
Then we hopped in the car, and I believe our next stop was Sag Harbor. Is that right?
Yeah, we went to Sag Harbor, home of John Steinbeck, once upon a time, and another bookstore. We had a great surprise, though. There was a John Steinbeck Memorial Park that Emily found.
So we got to the park and we thought, like, we spied these two little free libraries and we thought, oh, that's cool. And then as we got closer, we noticed that there was a bench by one of the little free libraries with this beautiful statue of John Steinbeck and his dog, Charlie. And Steinbeck, in his lap, he's got a piece of, it looks like a notebook where he's writing, and there's actual words on it with edits, which was really cool.
Yeah.
And if you've read Travels with Charlie, Sag Harbor is where he and Charlie took off from.
Yeah.
So it seemed very appropriate that that statue would be there.
Yeah, it was so charming. And it's a real lifelike, colorful sculpture. And Charlie is a full-size poodle and is sitting on the bench next to John with his paw on John's arm. And John is looking at Charlie with his head tilted like a dog. You know how dogs do that when they're like, what? Like, what? And so Charlie is really earnest looking at him. And John is the one with the dog tilted head. So it's just so cute. And the name of the statue is The Editor, which is just really charming.
Yeah. Unfortunately, both the little free libraries, they needed some attention. They didn't have many books and they looked like they were a little weathered, but it was a neat idea to be part of this park, which was right in a harbor, just beautiful. And then we walked across the street to Sag Harbor Books, a great bookstore with a tree inside, which I thought was such a great entry point, where they had most of their new arrivals were on a table where the tree was the centerpiece.
Yeah, this is a bookstore I've heard a lot about, Sag Harbor Books. And it's so bright in that first part. And then they have new books. And then they also have vintage books and then collectibles. So Emily found a copy of The Grapes of Wrath, a hardcover, in the vintage section, which it wasn't that expensive, was it?
It was a couple $100, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then there was a copy of In Dubious Battle that was, I think, signed by him that was like $3,500.
Yeah.
And that one was in a glass case.
Yeah, and I was a little embarrassed because there was a bookseller, and when we first walked in, I said to her, oh, do you have used books here? And she was kind of like, rolled her eyes at me like, uh-oh. We have more than just used books here. We have like very, very revered used books here.
Yeah. So then after that, we took another ferry. So instead of going back around the way we came, we decided to just head north so that we could explore Shelter Island, which Emily has actually read a lot about. So we took ferry number 2. It was Doris Day, total. Like, we were the last car to roll onto that little ferry. And like, we rolled on, they closed the door, we paid, and they took off.
Yes. And these are tiny little ferries that hold about, 6 cars, if that. And you can see the other side when you get on the boat. It's just a way to get across this little bay / body of water. And then when we got off there, isn't that where we went to another bookstore?
Yeah, we went to Shelter Island Library was our destination, but they were closing like within like 2 minutes or something. But then we also knew that there was Black Cat Books just down the street from them. And they were actually open an hour later than their website said. So we got to browse in there a little bit, which is really nice. It's a double-decker, 2-floor used bookstore. It had a lot of good local author and interest sections.
And a big section on Long Island also. And it was in a house, which is really cool. I love a restaurant or a store of any kind in a house.
Yeah. Yeah, they had a lot of art books too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, so they did.
Shelter Island was pretty fun to drive through.
And then we went to another ferry, which this one had a very long line. I think partly we hit it just at the workday was ending. So there were work trucks and things like that waiting for it. But it didn't take too long. No. It was one of those where we were kind of in a line that was weaving through a neighborhood. So we couldn't see where the end point was. So we weren't sure.
Yeah.
But it didn't take too long. And this one also was another very small ferry where you could see the other side and fit a handful of cars.
Yeah, this one was, I think, slightly bigger than the second one, but still small as far as compared to like the first ferry we took.
Yeah.
That had, I don't know how many cars that thing could hold, but it had like a huge semi roll onto it. So they're not just for tourists. It keeps the economy rolling in Long Island.
I mean, even on this little ferry, the person next to us was a work truck that was coming home from his work day, you know, somewhere, who looked like a contractor. So when we got there and we were able to go visit a library that had longer hours, was it called Greenport? Is that right?
Yeah, that was in the town of Greenport. It was the Floyd Memorial Library.
Beautiful little library.
Yeah, very beautiful and cozy. They had a fireplace in there and really nice first floor. And then they also had an upstairs, and that's where the fiction was.
Yeah, and at the end of each of the fiction shelves, there were these really cool nautical drawings there that made us feel like we were having this nautical day, including in the library.
Right. And they even had a bust of Abraham Lincoln. So I always say hi to Abe, my homeboy, whenever I see him. He shows up in a lot of libraries.
Well, in that town, I have to say, at this point we were heading to try to catch our ferry home. But that town of Greenport was one that when we drove through, I thought, I'd like to come back here. I would take the ferry and go explore that town someday and spend a little more time in the library and see what's there. And all the towns we went to, it definitely seemed like one where people lived year-round potentially there. It just had that vibe to me.
Yeah, definitely. And more diversity of lifestyles, because down in Bridgehampton, in that southern eastern fork of Long Island there, that is the Hamptons, and that is where the wealthy people have their big summer homes. Like Julie Andrews has a home there, and Martha Stewart. It is a highfalutin place.
And then we caught our ferry home and we tried to time it. And I feel like we did a great job to be able to see the sunset as we were heading back to New London, which was beautiful.
Such a beautiful ride. And we stayed outside because these big ferries that cross the Long Island Sound from Connecticut to Long Island are big. They're huge. Like the one that we went home on was even bigger than the first one. It was a double decker. Yeah. And there weren't that many cars on it. And no big trucks or anything, but several dogs. We got to meet one of the puppies who was just adorable. And then we also saw Cape Henlopen, which is one of the ferries that I had wanted us to be able to ride on, but the timing didn't work because, I mean, I don't remember how many ships they have in their fleet, but they have ferries going back and forth almost on the hour, it felt like. And Cape Henlopen is a ferry that was converted from a troop transport ship that actually was built during World War II and landed at Normandy on D-Day, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and we didn't get to take it, as Chris said, because of the timing, but we passed it in the water, which was pretty cool. Not quite the same as being aboard, but at least we got to see it doing its job.
It was so cool to see it. Somebody had posted about it on Facebook is what I saw. And I was like, what? And I knew that we were going to be going to Long Island. So I shared it and I tagged James Ben, who, is a former Connecticut resident writer who writes a lot about World War II. And of course he knew. And I said to him, I was like, you probably already know this, but
he's like, I do know. And I've written on it.
Exactly. Yeah. So
actually, I don't know if he said that.
The next time I hope we can ride on it just to pay our respects to it. So ferry number 4 was a big one and it was a beautiful ride home. I mean, we had perfect weather.
We had perfect weather. It was a beautiful day. I will go back there anytime. I mean, it was fun to have kind of a few spots that really we just had the one spot we knew we wanted to go to, which was that Barnes and Noble. But then to discover things along the way was so delightful. And there have to be more libraries and bookstores that we can go to. So I would love to go back. The one thing that was nice is in the summer, you have these really long days of light. You know, if we were to do it in the fall, it would be getting dark at 6 o'clock and our ferry ride home would be quite dark.
Yes.
So it was nice to be on the water in sunlight both ways.
Yes. And we do have plans to go back in the fall, to go to Fire Island.
Yes, that's right. Well, the only other Biblio adventure I had was thanks to one of our listeners, Kathy, who emailed us about an event with Percival Everett. To remind people, his most recent novel is James, and Chris and I went to a live event with him. This is one that was live, but they made a taping of it, so you can listen to it. We'll put a link in the show notes. And in this one, Percival Everett's in conversation with Cord Jefferson and Jelani Cobb. And Cord Jefferson adapted his novel Erasure and wrote the screenplay for American Fiction, and it was his directorial debut. Mm. He won an Oscar for the screenplay. I can't remember if the movie won an Oscar. I can't remember now. But one of the things Kathy said is, she said, I think you'll find this conversation a little bit lighter, like there was no politics. Because remember the event we went to, we said there seemed to be a little tension between the moderator of the event wanting to kind of have Percival Everett talk about things that he didn't seem excited to talk about. Mm-hmm. And this one is filled with a lot of laughs. They talk about their writing styles. It just has a different tone. And part of it is obviously they know each other well. Mm-hmm. You can tell. Whereas I think the event we went to, who knows, maybe they had just met right before the event, you know, right. I don't know.
Yeah.
Did I say it was sponsored by City Arts and Lectures? It's their podcast. So I just listened to it from the website, which I'll put a link in the show notes, but you can probably on your podcast app also find it through, if you find City Arts and Lectures, you know, podcast. So thank you, Kathy, for pointing that out to us.
Oh, that's awesome. We love that. We love getting good recommendations. Yeah. So for me, Biblio Adventures, I did not make it to Concord for that Henry David Thoreau gathering. I was a bit hobbled by injuries. I have an ankle injury and just wouldn't have been able to drive that, unfortunately. But I did go to the East Lyme Library here in Connecticut, where this is not necessarily book related other than The Women, right?
Yeah, by Kristen Hanna.
Yeah. So I haven't read that yet, but I plan on it. And I've been thinking so much about the series China Beach, which was really great TV show about nurses in Vietnam that is not streaming anywhere. But at the East Lyme Public Library, they have one of those perpetual book / DVD / CD sales. And the first season of China Beach was there. So I was happy to pick that up there and look forward to watching that. I don't know, though, if I'm going to watch it before or after I read the novel. And I did research a little bit about China Beach not streaming, and it has something to do with the music rights. Oh,
interesting. Yeah, that can get really complicated.
Yeah, it had a lot of great music. So I had a couch Biblio adventure. I watched a movie called Letters to Juliet. Have you heard of this one? It's an older movie. So the movie is about a woman and a man who are going on their pre-marriage trip before he opens his restaurant. His restaurant's opening in 6 weeks. So they go to Italy, and he's all swept into looking for suppliers for different things for his restaurant, which she didn't anticipate. She thought they were going on a romantic trip before things got crazy, right? So she's on her own a lot and walks by this area where she sees lots of young women crying and writing letters and then putting notes on this wall. And it turns out they're writing letters to Juliet of Romeo and Juliet, you know, expressing their love woes. And she finds out there's a group of women who are responding to these letters then, and they mail a letter. Well, long story short, she finds an old letter that somehow got pushed back between bricks, writes the woman anyway, even though it's like 50 years later. And that woman who wrote the letter is now an older woman played by Vanessa Redgrave, who looks just like she always has. I love her so much. But I researched that movie, and it's actually based on a book of the same name, Letters to Juliet, by Lisa Eve Friedman and Seal Jan Friedman, that chronicles this letter writing to Juliet, which I had never heard of. So This movie qualified. It's a rom-com. So I got to check a square off on my bingo card for our year of reading romance and got another Vanessa Redgrave fix.
Right on. That sounds like fun. I'll have to check it out.
And then yesterday I met a friend at Grand Central for lunch at the Oyster Room. But before that, I went to McNally Jackson because, it's just a few blocks away. So I hobbled over there and I was looking for one book in particular by Natalia Ginsburg, who is one of the writers that Juliet Grimes mentions in her book, The Lost Boy of Santa Chionia, which is out now. And they had it. It's in a collection, Valentino and Sagittarius. So I was happy to pick that up and a few other books and a couple gifts. And I ended up, the total came to $99.99. And I wasn't paying attention really because I knew I was getting gifts, right? So, and the bookseller's like, oh, you qualify for a free tote bag. I was like, oh. He's like, yeah, when you spend $100 or more, you get a free tote bag, and you somehow managed to do $99.99. He's like, so you get a tote bag, which was lovely.
Nice.
Look at that. It's the dogs of McNally Jackson, and it has drawings of all these different types of dogs.
Oh my gosh, how fun. That's so perfect for you.
Totally. So it was fun to be there, but it was really bizarre to be riding the train without you, I got to say.
We'll be together again soon.
Yes. So upcoming jaunts.
Yeah. So Rachel had a wonderful group of midwives that helped deliver Nina. And of course, the next time I saw them, I had to ask them if any of them had read The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon, which is about a wonderful midwife, one of the original midwives in Maine. And they hadn't. So I'm on the hunt this week. There's 2 independent bookstores right on the same block almost in downtown Traverse City. One's Brilliant Books and one's Horizon Books. So I'm going to go see if I can find copies of The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon to give them as gifts and, as a thank you for taking such good care of Rachel and baby Nina.
That's awesome. That's going to be my next fiction because I have 3 fictions I want to start, 3 novels I want to start next. When I posted them, everybody said, Frozen River, but I then picked up Mary, Queen of Scots. I was more in the move. I read 2 big novels back to back, and I thought, I think I need some nonfiction now.
Yes. Well, and then the other thing to remind people that, as you said, The Lost Boys of Santa Chionia is out now. And Juliet just had her launch at Books Are Magic in Brooklyn, and it is available on video if you want to watch her conversation with Sarah Weinman. So we'll put a link in the show notes. I have not had a chance. So that's going to be one of my upcoming Couch Biblio adventures. I can't wait to watch it, that conversation.
Yeah, me too. If I hadn't had my ankle injury, being in Manhattan that day, I would have stayed, but there's no way I could have, unfortunately.
New York's not an easy city to be hobbled in.
It is not. Oh, no. You should have seen me trying to walk up the stairs from the train into Grand Central. People are not very patient with you.
No. Did you have any upcoming jaunts?
Yes, I have a big upcoming jaunt coming up. It is going to be the Moby Dick Marathon at the Mystic Seaport Museum. I'm doing the overnight part of the marathon. So the marathon initially starts open to the public, but then if you've registered to spend the night on the ship, it's a 24-hour marathon. So our friend Colleen from Chicago is coming in for this. And I can't wait. She's actually getting in on Sunday, and we're going to do some biblio adventuring up to Massachusetts for a day or 2 and then Mystic. And I know our buddy Kate is going to be there too. So if anyone hears this in time to join us in Mystic, it's just admission to the museum for that day. I believe the marathon starts at noon and the museum's open until 5, I think.
How about upcoming reads?
Well, I decided to reschedule my year of Margaret Fuller because Moby Dick seems to have taken over. But another reason I'm rescheduling Margaret Fuller to next year is that in February of 2025, the Library of America is publishing a collection of Margaret Fuller's writing. So I'm going to start my kickoff of reading her in February 2025, and I'm looking for buddies to do it with. So if anyone out there would like to read along with me, I think it would be a lot of fun to explore her writing. So more to come on that. I also just wanted to make an announcement that October 29th is the next International Louise Penny Day, as that is the day that her next novel, The Grey Wolf, publishes.
Which is getting great reviews.
Yeah.
And is this like the 20th in the series? The 19th? I don't know. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot now. And I can't believe it, but it is a lot. And I just can't wait. I try to not read anything about them before they come out. And I don't request advanced reader copies. Like, that's the book that I love to go and get the day of at the bookstore, and then just hopefully be able to schedule the day that I could just read. But I have no idea yet what my work schedule will be then.
And then we both have a joint read of The Phantom Patrol by James Benn. This is the 19th book in the Billy Boyle World War II series. And James Benn is going to be a guest on a future episode of the podcast coming up in August. But we're also doing a live event with him that we want you all to know about on September 19th at 6 p.m. at the Mystic No Ink Library in Mystic, Connecticut. That bookstore, Bank Square Books, is sponsoring that event, and that bookstore is going to be in the process of moving around that time, which is why they're having the event in the library, which it's a beautiful library. We would love for you to come. And if you do want to come, we recommend you come a little early and explore the library and the town if you have time.
Yeah, Mystic's a pretty fun place.
And then we also have our third read-along coming up, our third quarter read-along coming up of Envy by Sandra Brown. We are getting so many emails and social media pings about this novel. We were a little nervous when we chose it because it is like 500 pages, but people are saying it is a very fast, very compelling read and should make for good, compelling conversation during our Zoom conversation, which will take place on September 15th.
Yeah.
Sunday, September 15th at 7 p.m.
All right. So if you would like to join us for that conversation, just send us an email to bookcougars@gmail.com. Let us know that you're interested, and we'll reserve your spot.
And just a little aside, since we're talking about Jenny from Reading Envy this episode, when I was scrolling back through our emails that we had with Jenny to try to remember the first time I ever met her, on September 19th, 2020, she sent this email to us that said, "Hearing about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing yesterday, the same day as a former colleague, I've been living in romance novels where the worst conflict is a misunderstanding and everything always works out in the end." Isn't that nice? I thought that was, that's part of why we're reading romance too. It's just really fun to read a book that you can be guaranteed a happy ending.
Right.
So curious to see what that is in Envy.
Yes, me too.
And the last thing is we do have some out now books. These are all books that were mentioned during our episode 200 where authors and other folks called in to tell us about books they couldn't wait for us to read. Bear by Julia Phillips, A Novel Summer by Jamie Brenner, and The Goodbye Process by Mary Jones.
Very cool. Thanks for listening, everybody. We wish you lots of happy reading.
Coming up next is our conversation with Shawn Breathes Books, who's a booktuber. We have appeared on his channel in the past, most recently to talk about the I'll Have What You're Reading memorial read-along that we're doing in honor of Jenny Colvin, who was a podcaster that passed away a couple of years ago in May, and we dearly miss her.
Yes, Jenny Colvin was the host of Reading Envy, and her tagline was, "I'll have what you're reading." So we thought that would make a great name for this memorial read along. And we each chose a different book from Jenny's Goodread lists. And we invited listeners to do the same. We have a chat going on our Goodreads page about that. Some folks are saying what they're reading. And then also using the hashtag, "I'll have what you're reading." And I've seen some people using that on Instagram and other places.
also been lovely to see how people knew Jenny, in what walk of life they met her, and what she meant to them as readers. The three of us share our memories of meeting Jenny for the first time and how we got to know her. I forgot to also mention that Jenny was an avid baker, and she had a blog, Jenny Bakes. And we'll put a link to that. It's still available. You can see what she loved to bake and how she wrote about it.
Jenny's book blog, Reading Envy, she had the podcast and the book blog as well. And all of her episodes are listed there, and some of her reviews. And she was just so helpful to me when I was thinking about going to library school, and then in library school, and just how to think about my career and different school options, different ways to focus my academic experience. So she was a fantastic librarian, an academic librarian in South Carolina. And as Emily said, we all miss her so much.
And thank you to everybody who read along with us. And that thread on Goodreads will be up forever. So if you're coming across this podcast years from now, feel free to go to that thread. We would love to hear you talking about Jenny. Jenny and I bonded over pie crust one time. On an episode, I mentioned that I was reading Rage Baking cookbook and saw that they put vodka in pie crust to make it flaky. And I got this long diatribe email from Jenny about her feelings on pie crust and all the different pie crusts she had baked in her baking career. So she was a great reader and a great baker, and just a wonderful book person, and a wonderful person, we should say.
Yeah.
We thought that it would be nice for people to hear her voice. Jenny had the most beautiful voice. Shawn mentions that in our conversation. We did co-read-alongs with Jenny, and the last time we did a read-along was on episode 221 of the Reading Envy podcast, where we read a poetry anthology called When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. It was a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry, and it was edited by Joy Harjo. And on the book Cougars, we had read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And there was a poem in the anthology that kind of spoke beautifully to both of those books. So we read it together by reading different stanzas. So enjoy hearing us read that poem. This poem is called Sweetgrass is Around Her. Sally M. Kawanataki Benedict. A woman was sitting on a rock. I could see her clearly, even though she was far away. She was Tiohantasen, my mother's aunt. She was a basket maker. When I was young, my mother told me that her name meant sweetgrass is all around her. I thought it was a good name for a basket maker. She was in her 80s then. She was short like me and a bit stout. She knew the land well, and the plants and the medicines and the seasons. She knew how to talk to the Creator, too, and the thunderers and the rainmakers. She had a big bundle of sweetgrass at her side. It was long and green and shiny.
Her big straw hat shaded her round face. It was very hot. She pulled her mid-calf-length dress down to her ankles, over her rubber boots. She brought her lunch in a paper bag, a canning jar of cold tea, fried bread, sliced meat, and some butter wrapped in tinfoil. She placed them carefully on the rock. She reached into the bag and pulled out a can of soft drink. I thought it strange. She didn't drink soft drinks. Then she reached for her pocket knife. Basket makers always have a good knife. It was in the pocket of the full-length canvas apron that was always safety pinned to her dress. She made 2 sandwiches, looked around, saw me looking at her. Her eyes sparkled. She smiled. She lifted up the soft drink and signaled me to come.
After we ate, she stood up on the rock and looked out. She smelled the air. I knew that she could smell the sweetgrass. I never could. She pointed to the very swampy land. Mosquitoes, I thought. I was dressed poorly. We didn't much talk, but we could hear and listen to each other. She never forced me to speak Mohawk. Mohawk with an English accent made her laugh. She didn't want to hear English, though. We would spend all day picking sweetgrass. Sometimes we would look for medicines. One time, my mother asked her what she thought heaven would be like. She said that there was sweetgrass everywhere and people made the most beautiful baskets.
That's beautiful.
So nice. I loved finding that in our anthology. It seemed like a nice connector.
We are so excited to welcome for the first time on our podcast, Shawn of Shawn Breathes Books. We have some BookTube royalty here, and we're so excited to talk with him, in particular about our memorial read-along that we've been doing celebrating Jenny Colvin of Reading Envy, a podcaster who passed away a couple years ago, who was a friend to all of us. And our read-along memorial was called I'll Have What You're Reading, which is Jenny's tagline. So each of us chose a book from Jenny's TBR or, something she may have read already. And so we're here to briefly talk about what books we chose. But first, we thought it would be really great for Shawn to introduce himself a little bit more to our listeners. Longtime listeners have heard his name before. And because I've mentioned you, we've been on your channel. So Shawn, if you don't mind introducing yourself in your own words, and then say a little bit about how you first met Jenny.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on. This podcast royalty, this is very exciting for me, so thank you. The only way that I'm BookTube royalty is that I named myself the Queen of Bailing many years ago. And in fact, one of my appearances on Jenny's podcast, I'll talk about Jenny, my friendship with Jenny in just a moment. That was the title of the episode, The Queen of Bailing. But after that, I got so much better at bailing that I promoted myself to the Empress of Bailing. So in that sense, really probably only, yes, I'm BookTube royalty. So yes, my channel used to be known for years and years as Shawn the Book Maniac, and I have recently changed it to Shawn Breathes Books. I started the channel about 7.5 years ago when I was living in Tokyo, and I've been back in Canada for a couple of years and still doing much the same thing, although since I came back to Canada, I've been also specializing in a lot of more regional Saskatchewan or Canadian prairie-based literature and author interviews, but I still read quite widely in lots of other areas of literary fiction. Emily and Chris have been guests on my channel many times, and we've always had a great time. So here I am. The way that I first got involved with bookish social media was through an app called Litzy. And Jenny was very active on there, and that's how she and I connected. Probably in about 2016, maybe even 2015. And eventually, we'd had so much contact, and we started sending private messages to each other through Goodreads that she invited me to be a guest on one of her episodes. And I think I was on 3 times in total over the years, and we always had such a good time. She was so encouraging of anybody who wanted to get more involved in bookish social media stuff, whether it's podcasting or whatever, and her podcast was a very welcome space for many a guest, including friends of mine that later became guests as well. So the community just hasn't been the same without her.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And I came to Jenny just looking for other bookish podcasts is what I remember. It must have been after Books on the Nightstand, Sunset, or maybe before. I wish I knew. I don't exactly know when, but I enjoyed her podcast so much, and it was because of your appearance on one of the episodes that I found you, Shawn, because I was like, who is this Canadian guy? Because I liked what you were saying about whatever books that you both were talking about. So I love that she led me to you, and, here we are.
And as I said, when we talked about this on my channel a month or 5 or 6 weeks ago, she's not here to defend herself. So, but yes, she did bring us together. So how lovely.
Yes, we will be sure to put a link in the show notes to our appearance on Shawn's BookTube channel when we introduce the I'll Have What You're Reading Memorial Read-Along. So, I couldn't remember how I learned about Jenny and the Reading Envy podcast, but I decided to scroll through the Book Cougars email And I came across an email, our very first contact with her, which she had sent through our form that we have on the website. So she didn't even have our direct email address at the time. And the email says, "Hi, Book Cougars. I thought you might like to know that episode 85 of Reading Envy on April 25th, 2017 has Thomas Otto as a guest. And he mentions the Book Cougars and Chris. A shout out, Jenny." And she put a little smiley face. And so that email was dated April 24th, 2017.
Wow.
And I think that's the first time we ever made Book Cougars contact with Jenny. And then, of course, ended up having her on as a guest, and we were on her podcast as well. And we did co-read-alongs several times with her.
Yes. And Thomas, I think it's through Thomas that I found out about you guys on Twitter. So, yes, it's kind of in this bookish social media salad that we're talking about.
Right. And at the time, I think Thomas was still the co-host of the Readers podcast, which has also sunset over the years. But I think that's what he was doing at the time when he was a guest on Reading Envy. So it's all of this. I love that idea, tossing up salad, the way that we get to know each other. But it's one of the wonderful things I love about social media and Goodreads. I never was part of Litzy, so it's interesting to know, Shawn, that that's how you originally met Jenny.
Yeah. Yeah, and for people that don't know, Litzy is kind of like Bookstagram, but it's a separate app. And since Bookstagram, the bookish community on Instagram, has gotten so huge, I think Litzy's still going strong, but there's not as much of a draw for me to go over there as I still keep tabs on what's going on Litzy. But yeah, it certainly was formative in my emergence, my debut into bookish social media.
Nice. Well, you all know about the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, that whole thing. I mean, that is definitely a reality on bookish social media regarding Jenny. I think everyone that I know who is a reader who has any contact on social media is connected to Jenny. It's quite amazing, the community that she built and the people that she brought together.
And she had such a beautiful speaking voice. Oh my God, just a delight to listen to.
Yeah.
And I think I was talking about this when you people were on my channel, that I once heard her do a little practice kind of musical scale just before she started recording, which I'll never forget. It made it into the podcast because it was a lovely little...
Oh. Shawn, can you replicate that for us?
No, I cannot, especially not today with my cough. Oh my God.
Well, let's then dive into the book that we chose for the I'll Have What You're Reading memorial. Shawn is our guest and royalty. Would you like to go first?
Certainly. So I said before, and I inadvertently lied, that it was my first appearance on Reading Envy, where Jenny talked about, for those of you that don't know, the premise of her podcast was the guest talks about 3 books they enjoyed, and Jenny would talk about 3 books that she enjoyed. And so one of the 3 books that she talked about, it was my second appearance. I believe it was February 2018. And she talked about a book by Rose Tremaine called The Gustav Sonata that had a gay protagonist. And I had never heard of it, so I read it after hearing her recommend it, talk about it so positively, and I enjoyed it a lot too. So when I went through Jenny's TBR on Goodreads, one of the millions of books that were there was another book by Rose Tremaine, her 1999 novel, Music and Silence. And I've had this book on my shelf for years. In fact, I've been collecting Rose Tremaine novels ever since I enjoyed the Gustav Sonata and had never gotten around to reading any of them. And so this was on Jenny's TBR. I have it on my shelf. I've been wanting to read more Rose Tremaine all these years, and so I picked it and I read it. This is a novel, it's a work set back in history. Some people call that historical fiction, that is set in the early 17th century at the Danish court of King Christian IV, and he hires a lutenist from England, Peter Clare, to come and play in his orchestra. And I don't know how much of it's based on historical fact, but he was one of the forerunners to surround sound or stereos because he had the orchestra in the basement of his castle, and he had pipes so that the music would play in whatever room he wanted throughout the castle. And it was really cold and damp down there, and so the musicians weren't very happy, but the king was. And so Peter Clare, this gorgeous blonde young lutenist, joins that, and the king takes a real shine to him. So that's the opening premise. It's very atmospheric. The life of the palace is very vividly described. And then I think I already said, I think Jenny would have enjoyed this more than I did. There were so many characters and so many backstories that they held my interest. But when I got to the end of this 500-page novel, I wasn't sure what the point of having all those characters and all those stories. They didn't really all need to be there. I would have appreciated a little bit more silence, a little bit more brevity, perhaps, to the novel. But it held my interest. I have a lot of criticisms of it too. Now, one of the things that I think Jenny might have loved, and I think you two would have possibly be much more into than me, is I hate fairy tales. I just think they're so silly. And there was a lot of fairy tale kind of vibes in this. So it wasn't realist fiction. It falls short of something like Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. And part of that is there's a lot of kind of a fairy tale element to the story that just so many of the characters were so black and white. And I also kind of want to do a feminist rant about this novel because so many of the women were just evil, villainous, sexually voracious and kind of almost like vampire-esque. And I wasn't sure that all that needed to be in there. The whole horror Madonna thing. I would have liked to read about some characters that were, had some flaws and had some good points. And that's more in the line of realist fiction. So I'm not sure that I really I didn't enjoy it all that much. I'm glad I didn't bail on it, but because I get to more authoritatively talk about what I didn't like, but it was an experience.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. The fairy tale thing and then the women being, the villains, they go hand in hand together.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you purchased all these other Rose Tremaine books. What are your plans for them?
Oh, I'm excited to get to them because most or a lot of the fiction that Rose Tremaine wrote is set more in modern day, contemporary. I probably wouldn't unless I do a lot more research on what other works that are set back in history were like before I'd try one of those, but there's all kinds of stuff set in present day or more contemporary times, so that's what I would go for first.
Good to know. Well, thank you for hanging in there with a 500-page book that wasn't exactly up your alley.
I did it almost completely on audio, and the audio narration was wonderful, so that helped.
With that many characters, did the audio have different voices for the different characters?
No, it didn't, and I was able to follow them all. I do admit that there was maybe 2 or 3 that were so incidental that when their stories came on, I just thought, I don't remember who these people are, so I'm just going to kind of tune out for a few minutes. But for the 15 central characters, I followed them all. Yeah.
Wow.
To keep the stories interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I love how music was our theme of that book, too, because that music was so important to Jenny in her life. I can't remember, Christy or Shawn, do you remember she had a degree in music theory or, right?
I
Something
don't
like
remember
that.
exactly what kind of a music degree it was, but it was definitely a music degree. And she did work.
She worked as a music librarian.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is a very, particular skill, you need to have to be able to be that type of librarian, to read music and understand notation and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Shall I talk about my book?
Sure.
Good. All right. So one of the things that was really important to Jenny was women's rights. And she was also a really strong ally of the LGBTQIA plus community. And she even was part of the American Library Association's, I think she chaired the American Library Association's Over the Rainbow Book List Committee, which helps bring LGBTQIA literature to adults, makes them available in libraries. Part of me wonders, not to get on a tangent, but what Jenny would think about all the book banning going on since her passing. I'm sure she would have been involved as a librarian somehow. So I decided from her TBR on her Goodreads page to choose a book that had LGBTQIA as part of the theme of the story. And so I chose This Is How It Always Is by Lori Frankel, which had been on my TBR for a long time. And it's about a couple living in Wisconsin that has 5 children. All of them are boys. And their youngest son, Claude, as he grows into a toddler, enjoys wearing dresses and really wants to dress as a girl. And as he enters into school, public school, his other brothers who have experienced, what it means to be in public school are worried about Claude and what it's going to be like for him going to school wearing dresses. So that's kind of how the story unfolds. And then the family gets a chance to move to the Pacific Northwest and kind of have a restart. When you have a geographic restart, you can reinvent yourself if you choose. And so they choose to present Claude as a girl, and that has positive and negative impacts on the family. And that's what the novel talks about. And it also talks about, I think, really gracefully, choices that parents make about the future of their child if they would like to have gender reassignment surgery, because there are certain choices to make before puberty. Lori Frankel has a transgender child, so although she makes it very clear in the author's note that this is not autobiographical, she certainly came to the novel with some experience of her own that I think lent it credibility as a reader. I really enjoyed it. When I closed the book, I felt like I was so sorry that I wouldn't have a chance to talk to Jenny about it. And I have to say, I felt really sad as I was reading the novel, just realizing I know it sounds so simple, but, to know that we can't pick up the phone and talk to her about these things going on in the literary community or books we read made me feel really sad and miss her a lot.
Had you read anything else by Lori Frankel?
I know, I want to say she's on to maybe her 5th novel now. I'm not exactly sure. I know that there are devotees that read any book that she puts out, but this is my only one, and I did really enjoy it. So I expect that I will pick up something else by her. Have you read anything by her?
No, I heard about This Is How It Always Is. I don't think it was on Jenny's podcast, but I heard about it somewhere, and it's kind of been on my radar ever since. So it sounds great.
The book I chose is nonfiction, and it is called Tides, The Science and the Spirit of the Ocean by Jonathan White. And this is a book that Jenny talked about either when we were on her podcast or she was on ours. I don't remember which way that went, but I remember thinking like, ooh, definitely want to read that because it sounded fascinating. And so I listened to it on audio, and I initially liked the narrator, and by the end, I did not.
Don't you hate that?
I know, but it was a good way for me to consume this book. I did dip into the book because I do have a paper copy of it. There are charts and maps, really fascinating things. And I know there are a few of the chapters I want to go back and read. So what this book is about is tides, the tides around the world in the oceans and other bodies of water, and how they have been perceived throughout history. And then specific types of research into wave and ocean studies. So there's a lot here that really piqued my interest in terms of like oceanography and history. For example, the Greeks and Romans don't have a lot of writing about waves or tides in their writing because there was a very small wave differential in the Mediterranean. It's like 3 inches. Whereas like in the Bay of Fundy, it's over 50 feet. In other places where it is, even a 2-foot wave variation from like low tide to high tide, that can really wreak havoc on people's lives and affect people's lives and impact how they work, things like that. And he brings in so much fascinating detail throughout history and time. And one of the most fascinating bits was talking about Moses in the Bible and how Moses actually may have been kind of like a really brilliant military strategist, because as somebody who lived along the Red Sea and knew how the tides worked and that there was a big tide differential and there was a sandbar that dried out, like he could have really planned it so that his people were across that sandbar before that huge tide started rolling back in, the flood tide started coming back in. And then over the centuries, then this story gets blown out of proportion, as myths do, to then become like they walk through 2 walls of water, right? I love that bit. So
he parted the sea, right?
Right.
Like that it was his. Yeah.
Yeah. And if
That's so interesting.
And when you look, I remember when I was a kid, I had this children's illustrated Bible. That's what it was. He was standing there parting it, and there are these 2 walls of water with people walking to the other land mass. Jonathan White is a sailor himself. He spends a lot of time on the water, and he got fascinated with tides when I think it was his schooner got stuck at one point, and he almost lost his ship. And, you think, oh, I've been sailing for decades, I understand tides. Well, no, not really, once you start digging into it. And I think the big takeaway is that there are no definitive understandings of tides because they're impacted so much by so many environmental factors that you really can't say, you can't make firm predictions. Let's put it that way. You can have kind of like an understanding of when the next flood tide might be, and you can predict those things out decades, but there's always going to be these variations because you can't predict the wind, say. You can't predict earthquakes that cause tsunamis that then cause massive waves in other parts of the world. So if anybody has the slightest interest in the oceans, I highly recommend this book. And Jenny, she gave this one 5 stars, and she herself was a big fan of the ocean. I know when we did our celebration for National Poetry Month that year that we had guests come on and read a poem and videotape themselves reading a poem, which I believe was why we started this YouTube channel that we have. She just had her phone recording the ocean, and she read the poem. So she's not in it physically, but you see the ocean waves. I don't remember what poem it was she read.
The link in the show notes.
Yeah.
Because it's still up, right?
It is, yeah. All of those are still there. So I'm really glad to have read this one. I should just add, I think I got away from saying something about the narrator. One of the reasons he got on my nerves is that he would do accents for all of these different people, because each chapter deals with a different area of the world. And so he's doing the accents of a lot of people. And sometimes it's wonderful, and other times it's just cringe. There you have it. But the book is fantastic.
You wonder if Jenny listened to it on audio or not. I know she was really jazzed about the book because we were recording with her, I think, as she had just finished it, or maybe she was partway through. I know it was like the most recent read of hers, and she talked so much about it when we were recording with her.
Yeah, she had been to Orcas Island, where it was on display everywhere. And in reading his acknowledgments, he thanks the librarians there, or researchers, one of the two at Orcas Island. And it's like, oh, okay. I'm sure any tidal area would have this on display, but knowing that he thanks folks there directly is one reason why I'm sure it was everywhere.
So cool. Well, I'm so glad we did this memorial read along in honor of Jenny. And for any of you out there who've been doing the read along, we do have a thread on Goodreads that you can participate in if you'd like, or just send us an email and let us know what you read and what you thought of the book. Jenny would be so glad to know, I think, that we're all out here reading in her honor.
Yeah, it was a beautiful way to pay tribute to one of the world's most wonderful readers.
Yeah. Recently, Chris and I talked about an Alice Munro short story called Trains. We read this because Alice Munro had passed away, and we thought it would be interesting to read it kind of in memoriam and talk about this author that was revered for her short story writing. Very soon after her death, an essay was written by her daughter, Andrea, about sexual abuse at the hands of her stepfather, who was married to her mother, Alice Munro. Shawn is a devoted fan of Alice Munro, and this news came as a shock to him. He has a video on his BookTube channel that we'll link to where he spoke about his feelings now. But while we were talking with him, we thought it would be a good time to have our own conversation with him about our feelings about Alice Munro and this new information that came to light.
Well, since we are here with Shawn Breed's books, Shawn is from Canada, and one of his favorite writers had been in the news recently for a couple different reasons. A few episodes ago, Emily and I read a short story by Alice Munro, Trains. We read it after she died in tribute to her, and we discussed it. And then, a week or two later, it feels like revelations came out by her daughter, Andrea Robin Skinner, about how she had been molested by her stepfather. And since we have Shawn here from Canada, who has done a video about the revelations, we thought we would have a conversation about this because it is breaking literary news and really significant. Not just literary, but also feminist and child's rights and protections. Shawn actually did 2 videos concerning Alice Munro. So, Shawn, do you want to jump in and tell us a bit about those?
Yeah, sure. So I was greatly affected when Alice Munro passed away. She had been one of my favorite writers, and I had been to readings with her over the years and had signed copies, and it was a real event in my reading life whenever a new collection came out of her short stories. She was, and in terms of Canada, she's an icon, not just in terms of literature, but just in terms of a famous Canadian, and there aren't very many of those. So, yeah, it was just quite, even though she was in her 90s and had retired from writing for more than a decade, it was still a real loss. And so I convened a panel of readers who loved her writing, and we talked about her writing, and we all also read one of her short stories and talked about that. And that video is called Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which was kind of a cheeky title, but it was a very respectful, kind of mournful and celebratory video. And then a few weeks after that, I think the time between her death and the revelations that her daughter published was about 6 weeks, perhaps, something like that. And so I was just absolutely crushed to find out from her daughter, publishing her account of what her life is, that her daughter was sexually abused by her stepfather. That was Alice Munro's second husband. Alice Munro and her second husband, they lived in Ontario, and the ex-husband, Jim Munro, who had a famous bookstore in Victoria, British Columbia, Munro's Books, which is still there today. That's who the daughter lived with, except in the summer when she would go and spend the summer in Ontario with her mom and stepdad. So when the 9-year-old daughter came home, she told her stepmother about the abuse, and the stepmom told the father, Alice Munro's ex-husband, and nothing was done. Well, what was done was the next summer, when the youngest Munro daughter was sent to stay with the evil stepdad and Alice, an older sister was sent along to kind of chaperone her. So the ex-husband thought that would be enough. Well, it wasn't enough. So the abuse continued for years. Alice Munro herself didn't find out about the abuse until maybe 10 or 15 years later. And she briefly separated from her husband, and she treated it as if her husband had cheated on her with her daughter. So she didn't ever really have a mother's reaction about her daughter's abuse. She was just incensed that her husband had cheated on her. And then ultimately, after a few months, went back and spent the rest of his life back in that marriage with him, and never really dealt with anything to do with her daughter, having acknowledged with her daughter having told her about the abuse. So it was just the most awful parental reaction that you can imagine. So that just turned my stomach and turned Alice Munro from being one of my favorite writers to being kind of persona non grata. So yeah. I'm a very emotional person, and so my reaction is and shall ever be that, I won't read her. I'll probably get rid of her books on my shelf. And I have a new hero, her daughter, for coming forward with this story and showing such bravery and probably helping a lot of people out there.
Yes.
Going public.
Yeah. The thing is, it also was a court case. This did go to court, and the stepfather was convicted of sexually assaulting his stepdaughter. And I guess Alice Munro's reaction to having gone back to her husband was, I am not responsible for men, and I love him.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And I've been with him too long to look at having a life without him at this point. I love him. It's horrible. And I think Andrea is so brave to come forward. I mean, when someone in your family is idolized, it is virtually impossible to have your own public facing image that isn't completely within the mirror of that other person. And so people who have accused her of waiting until her mother died to publish this essay, I feel like is such a waste of energy. And if you really think about it from her point of view, it makes complete sense to me that she waited till her mother had passed away for this information to be made public, because there had already been a court case, as you said, Chris, and other public venues for Alice Munro to speak to what happened with her daughter and her husband and the daughter's stepfather. So this is my big takeaway, is I wish more people would focus on the things that Andrea said that could improve the plight of people who have been sexually abused. And she really spoke to how it affected her mentally and physically as a child and all of her years growing up, and how she had to separate herself from her family and eventually got the help she needed and had a relationship with her siblings moving forward. And that is such brave, hard work to do in a family that's keeping secrets. So I just want to publicly say that I commend her for doing that really difficult work and then talking about it in this essay to help other people who might be in the same situation.
Absolutely. And I feel a little bit uncomfortable with how much I centered my reaction as a reader and how devastated I was. That's all true. But what you said and what Andrea Skinner has done is the real story here.
Yeah, it is a real thing when you have a writer that you love and you've been reading for decades and you find out something like this about them. It is devastating for the reader as well. I think there are probably a lot of different reasons why she came out when she did with this revelation. And, we don't know exactly why, do we? But you can imagine that all of those accolades that were flying around after her death, it could have been part of her continued healing to make it public. And I wondered too, that since there was a court case in Canada and he was convicted, why was this such a national secret? Is it just the Canadian journalists? They don't smell blood in the water like American journalists do to expose things like this?
Well, that may be part of it. It was actually much more regional than that. The courtroom was in one small city in Ontario that was, 30 miles away from the town where Alice Munro was living with her husband. And one of Alice Munro's best friends was interviewed in the last few weeks. And she said, the news didn't even reach our town from that courtroom 30 miles away. So it was just, there was a sense of hushing it up because she was a famous person. And it was never reported in the media. And it was just kind of kept under wraps, despite it being a public. I mean, it wasn't a court case because he pleaded guilty. But so it was a very short duration, but it was public, and it never became actually public.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Well, talk about a new hero, right? I mean, the bravery that it took for her. And as you said, Emily, to even just go forward with her own healing, it takes a lot to make that first step.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chris, I know you recently read a book that's very much related to this topic. I can't remember the exact title, Art Monster or something?
Yeah.
By Claire Detter.
Yeah.
Do you have anything from there that you'd like to share?
It was Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma by Claire Detter. I did a buddy read with Britta on that. And, neither one of us was wowed by the book. And it was more of a memoir of her trying to figure things out. And she never really came to too many conclusions that would be helpful to other people. It is, I think what she kind of ends up saying is it's a personal decision whether or not you want to watch the movies of Woody Allen, which is, what she started off with, or reading Lolita, if you choose to do something like that. And there were some interesting articles in relation to the Munro revelations concerning Lolita, which the ex-husband actually used a lot in his defense. There were a bunch of letters written among the adult family members about that. And again, I think that book, Monsters, suffered a little bit from not great marketing or jacket copy because it is much more of a memoir. I mean, the subtitle is A Fan's Dilemma, so it really is about her own personal experience. It's not heavily researched or anything like that. It's something I struggle with myself when I learn things about writers or artists. I too, Shawn, just like you, I have an emotional response to that, and I usually cannot read the writer anymore. Like, I used to really love Hemingway's writing, and the more I've learned about him, I just can't even go there anymore. There's a short list of writers who I've been wanting to read who I just won't.
Fortunately, those lists are getting longer by the day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I totally understand your predicament, Shawn. And I mean, you still had all of those hours of reading her writing that you enjoyed, right? I mean, the New York Times just put out that 100 notable books list and she appears on it. So her writing is still there. Her books are still there. It's a fan's dilemma, right? Mm-hmm. You know, what are you going to do?
But her writing will never be read in quite the same way again. Now, there's always going to be that huge subtext going throughout the novels, or her short stories, I should say. And even the story we read, Emily Trains, I felt some real sexual things. And now, and I'm not tempted to reread the story at all.
Yeah.
But I can imagine people who are reading and knowing about this family secret will have a very different understanding of those stories.
Yeah.
Those readings now will be inflected by the information that's now available about her. And she wrote so much about sexual aggression, sexual assault, all of those issues, and how that shaped and damaged so many young women. And now we're going to read those stories. Not me, I'm bowing out, but people are going to read those stories in a very different light.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Shawn, thank you for talking with us about this difficult subject.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
I'm glad we had this chat.
And I think it'd be nice just to end by saying that one of the things that's come out after Andrea's essay has gone public is about enablers, and that no child sexual abuse happens without enablers around them. In this case, for Andrea, it was her own father who was one of the enablers. So if you know of someone who's being sexually abused, please report it to the authorities.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.